Welcome back to a new year of the Max Term podcast. Kyle Stitcher alongside James Finch. And today, first off, we're happy to be back. We were going to probably record last week, but we decided to delay our recording because it allowed us to get our contract projections up at AFP Analytics on X, Blue Sky, Threads. We're trying to do some cross posting on all platforms. We're still going to be on X right now for the foreseeable future, but if we can gain a following on other places, we're certainly not opposed to utilizing those platforms more. We're kind of sticking where we have the largest audience. Full disclosure, full remarks there. So X is still probably the place that we're going to be most active. But again, if you're listening and you are on Blue Sky, give us a follow, encourage other people to follow us, and we might ramp up the content there as well, or in lieu of X at some point. But right now, we just don't have the same numbers. So that's full disclosure. That's reality. Appreciate you listening. Max Term Podcast, available on pretty much all major podcast platforms. And today we're going to get into those contract projections. And as well as, I guess, in tandem with that, introduce something new that we've been working on behind the scenes. It was kind of my summer project, got set to the side when, a wedding kind of took a little bit of precedent at a point. So anyways, it got set to the side, kind of finished up, and we're going to talk through it. We're going to call it still in beta phase, but we're kind of putting it out there. So let's start with the contract, kind of an overview of where we stand with the contract projections. We're going to do that, talk about this max stat thing that you will see on some of our graphics, and then we'll get into some specific players' contracts after that discussion.
Yeah, so I guess to jump into a little bit of a general overview of our contract. So second year doing it mid-season. So how do we actually go about doing that? We're looking at players who are going to need a new contract, so they will be pending free agents this offseason.
Should mention both restricted, both unrestricted.
Both restricted, unrestricted. So in our sheet right now, don't remember the exact player count, but the exact contract count is 289. You referenced RFAs just now. Some of the higher quality ones have multiple deals in there, so a long term and a short term.
Thinking that numbers probably I'd kind of focused more on the RFAs this time around. I think it was maybe 10 to 15.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 270 players probably.
Yep, give or take. And yeah, so our plan, as it was last year, is these are out there right now. We'll eventually have our off-season projections roughly mid-May, but this will be the update to players' values for the time being. A lot of these players did have a projection last off-season. It came a little bit later than the first release as extension. So something new-ish that we're trying to do here in this sheet is we've got a column set up for the trending of a player. So whether they're trending up, whether they're trending down, or if they are kind of in general in a similar spot. So as of right now, and we've kind of been going back and forth with each other about really how the best way, or what is the best way to do that. It's set up right now that if a player increased or decreased over $250,000, that would be trending up or down, and a increase or decrease smaller than that is a similar contract. 250K being in general, when everyone refers to contracts, that's kind of how we look at changes in value by that 250K mark. At the same time, percentage might be a little bit of a better way to go about that, especially as the cap changes, or the expected cap for the upcoming season changes. We'll get into that in a little bit. But as of right now, all of these AAVs are calculated using a projected cap hit percentage with 92.5 million, which is kind of the most recent estimation that is not set in stone, but that was kind of the consensus. That's what it's going to be. And we're starting to hear a little bit more rumors about changes there. But for now, we're going to keep it at 92.5. Throughout the sheet, one thing that was new last year, tax impacts on take home pay. That's still in there. You can take a look at that. We're pretty much looking at a few different situations. So there's our projection that we call market value. That's kind of the midpoint. And then we also give a number for the worst tax situations. It's an average of the worst 5. And there's also a number on the flip side, the no state income tax average. So there's a number for that as well. So 3 different values with, again, that midpoint being our general market value projection.
It might be the worst 6, but it's not that big of a deal.
Okay.
I think it's middle 6, worst 6, and then 6 no state tax.
Okay.
Just for, but it's not changing things that much.
Right.
But it's kind of trying to give a range of where the contract would be expected to fall depending on where it's signed.
Yep. And then lastly, after that section in the sheet, there are the comparable players. Definitely want to mention these are not all of the comparable players that we use to come to a projection for each player. It's some of the stronger comps, some of the ones that either are just really strong from a play standpoint and or would just matter in negotiations. So you can take a look at those. You'll also see us posting from time to time the graphic we have set up, which isn't out there available for everyone to just go grab whatever player. If you'd like to see one, feel free to add us on X or Blue Sky or Threads, wherever you're tuning in for content, and we might be able to get a graphic out there to you. But you'll see on that graphic our projections, that tax info, the comparable players. Anything else you kind of want to cover before we kind of switch gears slightly here?
I think 2 things to emphasize. One, again, we start by getting a cap hit percentage, kind of the average of our comparable players nets out to a percentage of the cap that they would sign for. So that allows us to compare contracts signed 10 years ago to contracts signed last offseason in kind of equal value. We kind of get to the years the same manner. It's an average of the comparable players. And then we take the cap hit percentage times what we expect or what the salary cap is. And again, just emphasizing this is under a $92.5 million cap. So it sounds like this is going to be low. So when we hit the off season and the cap's higher, our numbers are going to go up naturally. We had talked like the middle road, like a $500,000 player, we're talking $5 million player is going to go up about 250,000 ish if the numbers, the 97 million number is correct. Top of the end, like Rotten, Marner are in the mid to low 600,000 potentially changing. So if you tune in now and then tune in again in the off season, you see, wow, those numbers went way up. It's not necessarily, it could be reflective of their performance to finish the season, but it might just be the fact that we are now operating under a different salary cap.
Yes, and so the real key thing there is we're projecting a cap hit percentage, and anytime we do these contract projections, we're just doing a calculation cap hit percentage versus what the cap is going to be. So like Kyle said, again, this is AAVs calculated using 92.5 million. It sounds like that it's likely to be a higher salary cap than that. So if you're really trying to compare, and we'll help you do this in the off season, but it's really looking at that cap hit percentage to see if true value of the player changed or if he's just going to get a little bit more money because the cap's rising.
And that's probably why we will have to do the trending based on percentage instead of dollar numbers. So
Right.
I just wanted to throw out some numbers because I find this interesting. So I think there's a common perception. I've done a little like studying of it. I wouldn't say it was the best like study, but I have looked into the idea before of like, do contract years, is that a thing? Is that an actual thing? So you would expect, if that's a thing, for players to perform better when they're up for a contract. And so we had used 250,000 to set trending up down. You had also ran it using like 360, which is kind of usually in our margin of error range. So basically, if a player still is in our usual margin of error, they don't change. With the 250, we have 51 trending up, 81 similar, 87 trending down. And I know that number that was trending up when we had applied 360,000 was even smaller, and the ones kind of staying the same. So I just kind of think that that's an interesting talking point as far as the idea of overperforming in contract years. Maybe it's us kind of smoothing our model or our process, our model a little bit, knowing that it's more than just a contract year. But I do find it a little bit interesting that the numbers kind of don't bear out like a lot of players excelling this season.
Yeah, I think in general, getting more solid insight on that is going to happen really as we release projections again this offseason. Because last year was the first time we did this mid-season and off-season. So we can kind of compare there, but that's just 1 year. Being able to compare again this year gives us a little bit more of a sample to kind of see like whether or not we might be overreacting in certain situations, or maybe we're not reacting enough to changes in play. One of our big things we were talking about was how do we how do we react to half a season that is really good
Or really bad.
or really bad. One thing or one example that jumps out to me from last year was Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. Had pretty much a really good second half. How do you value a really good second half versus a really good first half? So, in general, it's much more recent when you're signing a contract in the off season after having a January, February, March, a little bit of April that was really good. But when you have a September through December, halfway through January, that's really good after maybe some bad seasons. What does that mean? How much of an increase does a player get? We still have half a season where they could come back down to earth, or they continue it and we might see further growth. So I think it can sometimes be a little hard to read from off season to mid season, and we might have a little bit more of a full picture on a player as we get more towards the off season.
I didn't want to go too many player specifics here, and just one more kind of on that discussion point, then we will get into the max, kind of what max stat is and how we it's computed and everything like that. Ryan Lindgren, I think, was one that we really debated multiple times, played around with the parameters, the comps, stuff like that, because there is a discussion how much realistically should he drop in half a season. So we kind of landed on, well, when we redo him in the offseason, it could drop more potentially. But like there's a point in time, like we already dropped him. I don't know what we ended up dropping him from, like the last from his current contract and or our last projection for him.
So we had him drop 900,000 from our projection last off season, which was pretty much right in line with what he ended up getting from an AAV standpoint. We had him drop about 900,000 to 3.6 mil on a 3-year deal right now. So if he continues to trend downwards, we could see the AAV drop a little bit. We could see the length of the deal drop as well. But that is one where we kind of look at it, and it's hard to gauge because it's really only been half a season. He didn't have a strong ending to last year, but he was also injured. That's something we tried to factor in. So it's still something I think we're trying to figure out how to best handle situations like that.
Yeah, because expecting, I don't know, we also probably should have mentioned a little bit earlier, our data was pulled basically right after the start of the new year. So it takes us a couple weeks to get through everything. I don't know, I think you pulled it like January 6th, 7th, somewhere in there.
Most teams were in the 38 to 40 games played range.
So, I mean, we would generally say that that would be enough of a sample, and like we don't need necessarily more games because it's not going to shouldn't dramatically impact the way a contract trends. I mean, half a season at times even feels a little like silly to like have a big trend, but
Right. So I guess using Lindgren as the example still, there's some insight that we can take from, okay, last offseason he got a 1-year contract. That means something. Generally means something not good when the original our projection was, I believe, 3 years last offseason. So taking that into account of, okay, there was already some acknowledgement maybe of things might not be going too well right here. So there's a lot that plays into this. It's going to be trial and error, probably for even another year after this of how much do we want to react. But we'll be able to see how situations like Lindgren play out. Andrei Kuzmenko is another one. Someone I saw added us on X and said, "What are you guys thinking here? How much can you drop a player in half a season?" That's up in the air still for us.
yep. And the other thing that's still up in the air is how teams are going to operate with a guaranteed cap rising, like a steady cap increase as well. We've been doing this for since 2019, but in the time from 2019 to last offseason, the cap had risen maybe $10 million over that entire stretch of time,
There were 2 or
approximately.
3 seasons it didn't move.
Something like
So
that,
like it,
or a million. Yeah.
yeah, right. So it, in a way, there's us doing an extra run through of contract projections at the same time, also sort of being a little new to a rising cap, or doing projections with a rising cap. We'll have to see. We'll see how some of these perform. We'll release them again in the off season, see how those perform, and make adjustments from there.
So, one of the new elements we have, Max Stat, kind of nod to this podcast,
Oh yeah,
and maximizing a player's ability, kind of as well.
yep.
So, what is it? What can you glean from it? What shouldn't be it? What should it be used for? What shouldn't it be used for? Where is it? Where is it going to go? Those are all great questions. I think I have some answers, but we're
Right.
also still calling this beta because I feel pretty good about the work I put in, and I think I'm not going to say it's the most rigorous statistical modeling, but I did my due diligence as well. Like this is not built on a bunch of regression models or anything like that, but it is grounded in pretty solid like statistical basis.
Before you dive in a little further,
Sure.
you you already mentioned this, but I want to make sure it doesn't kind of fall to the side here. You mentioned the word ability, and you can expand on this a little bit more if you'd like, but I Just want to make sure we're very clear that what this stat, at least at the moment, what it is, it's kind of looking at players' abilities. It's not necessarily like a lot of people might look at a stat like this, especially how we're presenting it, and think of it at, similar to war. It's not really a war stat. In a way, we might see a lot of the better players ranking a lot higher because they're better players. But that's not necessarily what this is meant to be doing.
Yeah, and that's where kind of showing the aggregate is a little bit. So I think so. Like, yeah. So I would describe it as it's really a descriptive statistic with multiple components that should be assessed on their kind of own merits. And the way I have it set up, so basically it's a bunch of components all normalized to the mean of for that particular component, broken up forwards and defensemen. So forwards are normalized to each other, defensemen are normalized to each other. And then I did a little weighting, kind of playing around with what's going to give me the highest R value year to year correlation year to year. So there is a level of consistency. Like if a player is consistently in a certain area in the stat, they should stay relatively in that area. So there's a little bit of predictability that players who do these particular skills well generally continue to do these particular skills well, but the aggregate is a little bit of a dicey, like it's not. I think there, like I did add up each team's for this year. I had added up each team's cumulative max stat, and there is a level of, like, I didn't actually run a correlation, I just kind of eyeballed it, sorted it by highest team to lowest team. A lot of the teams at the bottom of the standings, or a lot of the teams are the ones with the players with the worst aggregate max stat. Not saying everyone. Like St. Louis, I know they're not doing great this year, but they were, I think, third or fourth from the bottom two teams, bottom three teams maybe. Anaheim, San Jose, and Chicago in some order. I think Chicago is there. I think those three in some order. I forget what the order was. I think it was then St. Louis and then Buffalo. Most of the bottom teams are there.
Which, depending on how you want to look at it, in a way might make some sense. Worst teams, worst players, that I think is where we would put the question mark into this, because I don't think that's necessarily a for sure thing. There's also, I remember towards the very beginning of putting this together, kind of the first run through, and I'm assuming when you added all those up to look at the teams, very similar. A team like Carolina was probably very high.
Yeah, I pulled up. I did save it. I was smart and saved it. Pulled it up. Carolina's number one.
Right. Which, if anyone who has any sort of knowledge, even if it's not very strong, but you just have an idea of how statistics, analytics kind of match up team to team, you'd expect Carolina to be real high. But there's, and we don't necessarily have all the answers here, but there is, kind of similar to the contracts, there's still things to find out, and we're going to kind of have to find it out over time. One of those questions being, this is looking at players' ability. When we add it all up, it is kind of in line best team to worst team. Is that actually painting the full picture we want it to be painting when we're looking at players individually? Maybe.
I should apologize to Chicago.
They're
They
not
were
as low.
not numbered. So bottom teams in the aggregate max stat: Anaheim, Detroit, San Jose, St. Louis, Buffalo, Columbus, Nashville, then Chicago, then Montreal, then the Rangers, then Ottawa, then the Boston Bruins, Pittsburgh Penguins, Tampa Bay Lightning. So now we're starting to get, I guess, probably 20. I think we're probably about 20 or 10 from the bottom. Toronto Maple Leafs. New York Islanders grade out well, so they're grading out better here than their standings. Seattle Kraken as well. Calgary. I think Calgary's like right in the middle of the pack, which is not surprising at all. Utah. Minnesota Wild. Dallas Stars. Washington Capitals. Vancouver Canucks. LA Kings. Probably the surprise team that I haven't said yet, Philadelphia Flyers. They grade out well aggregate because they're having a couple players who are having unreal seasons in terms of the way that the stat metrics. I think I'm going to call it a metric right now.
Okay.
The way the metric kind of lines up. Travis Konecny is like, I think, top 5 or something.
Yeah.
Then Winnipeg, Vegas, the Devils, Oilers, Colorado, Florida, and Carolina. Most of the good teams are towards the top. Most of the teams that I think anyone would agree are struggling are towards the bottom. There's some teams here and there. And I haven't dug completely into everything. I just kind of had done that post hoc and here we are talking about it basically.
So, I guess first off, when we're putting out our graphic that we have for the contract projections, I kind of left this out before that, or when I talked about it before. There is kind of along the right side of it, the max stat for each player. So the way we kind of have that displayed, at the top we give you the overall max stat for that player, and we have it labeled F max and D max just as a reminder. Pretty much forwards are separate from defensemen when we look at this.
It's not that they're dissimilar, but the weightings and the scalings are slightly different.
Right.
So like if someone's way more at the top, yes, they have more as a defenseman, they have more ability than a forward in the middle. But that's not necessarily, we're not necessarily saying that Makar has more ability than McDavid, for example. Because I think Makar's first. I believe he is.
He's right up at the top. I believe he was first. How the max stat breaks down. So again, there's that one main number, just the general max of the player. But as you referenced, there's different components of it. So as of right now, there are 6 different components. They're each made up of different things.
All 5v5.
All 5v5. That might be, just to make it very clear right here, that's probably one of the most important things here. All the stats that make this up, it's looking at 5v5 play. So no power play, no penalty kill, just to be 100% clear that none of those or none of that time is impacting this stat. So of those 6 components, I guess we'll kind of start with just what we have first, sniping.
So this is combining NHL Edge with just general goal scoring shot data. And we're looking at basically how well, so players get credit for taking more shots from farther out, which I know is a little counterintuitive to how you think goals are scored in hockey. So this is the anti-Zach Hyman metric or component, I guess. So players who are taking shots from farther out but also converting them are those that are going to be towards the top of this list. those who are not doing one of those two things are going to trend more towards the bottom of the list.
So I guess just kind of as we move along, I'll use one example. Mikko Rantanen. So Rantanen's sniping comes out to a 1.37. And it's going to take a long time for everyone to probably get used to what that means, but we're also trying to display what percentile that has him in, essentially.
So that would basically mean that he is 1.3 standard deviations better than the average forward. So a little bit towards exceptional. I mean, there's definitely players farther out.
Some, not a lot.
But not a lot, yes.
Not a lot. So, and again, this is Mikko Rantanen. He's a forward, so this is in comparison to other forwards that would have him force the sniping ability here in the 91st percentile.
Yep.
So, kind of what you would expect.
Correct.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very, very good. Another component of the max stat, we're calling it passing.
I think this might be one of my. I'm pretty happy with this.
I like it.
I like it a lot.
It is one of my favorite ones too, I think.
So I had pulled Corey Snyder's tracking data to benchmark my idea against it. All of the metrics used, all the components of everything that we're going to discuss is publicly available data. I use Natural Stat Trick. Shout out to them. They have a great user-friendly database to download kind of the quote-unquote advanced stats, but then it's just edge data and NHL play-by-play data. Nothing that, I mean, anyone has access to it.
Right.
So I had benchmarked against Corey Snyder, who does manual hand tracking of many different metrics. So I had benchmarked some of my things against what he has actually tracked to see if my ideas were on the right path. Because I think it's pretty widely accepted in like the analytic community that what he's tracking is good data.
Yes.
He obviously is one person. He can't track everything, and that's completely understandable. When you're trying to do something like this, you kind of need to figure out a different, if you want to integrate something like that, you kind of need to figure out a different way to do so, because it's not fair to him to rely on, like, put pressure on him to have what you need, and it's just not going to work as well for us. So with all that said, I used a player's total assists and the on ice shots that they're basically line mates plus defensive pair mates, so the other four skaters on the ice take, to approximate how many pass shot assists they have. So if their ratio of assists to goals scored when they're on the ice that isn't by them, I'm assuming, it's a little bit of a leap, but stats kind of checked out, and I'll get into the correlation number in a second. So the assumption is ratio of assists to goals will be similar as the ratio of shot assists to on ice shots. Again, not taken by that player. Goals scored not taken by that player. In general, I had done a couple years of back testing, see how well this was. My R value, correlation value, low 0.7s, which I think is pretty darn good. So I'm not. Is it perfect? No. But I have a full season data. I was trying to scale to Corey's data, which also might be imperfect, but still say the correlation pretty strong. So feel pretty good about what this is.
Yeah, and I guess to follow that up, just another reminder. So we're releasing this as the max stat beta. This is very early as far as looking at and building out a stat that we are extremely confident in. Early results, we're pretty confident in it, but it's not to say how the stat is made up is going to stay exactly the same. It could definitely change a little bit as a little bit more time goes on. There's more data. We see something that's good or bad and kind of need to adjust a little bit. So it's very early stages. That's why we're calling it max stat beta. So we went through sniping and passing. I guess I'll jump to puck man. Well, actually, really quick before I do that, stick with the example of Mikko Rantanen. His passing came out to a 1.4, and my screen just went dark. That would have him in the 92nd percentile. So again, kind of what you would expect as far as Mikko Rantanen, both shooting or sniping and passing grades in the low 90 percentiles.
So one of the best players overall in the league to generate goals, basically.
Right. And you know what? So actually, since you mentioned that, I'm going to skip puck management for a second
I think that's fair.
and just general offensive impact. That's a stat that we have. Let's dive into that a little bit.
So let me talk about best offense and best defense. So offensive defensive impacts in tandem here. Buckle up, folks, because there's some. Let me just read my summary that I had sent to you.
Okay.
And then you can ask more questions, because you never really asked me questions in person on these two. But so the offensive, what did we end up calling it?
I just labeled it offensive impact.
Offensive impact determines how effectively the team is generating offense when a player is on the ice compared to time spent outside the offensive zone. And this time is scaled relative to the team's kind of ability. So Carolina, for example, spends a lot of time as a team in the offensive zone. So it's scaled down. So Carolina players get a little bit of a decrease in their, like, there's a higher bar for them to have to clear to grade out well. And it also accounts for what sort of deployment they're getting. So whether they're getting defensive zone starts, on the fly starts, neutral zone, offensive starts, it's trying to capture all of that. And it's basically using expected goals for as the metric that's making up that's kind of the offensive metric, if you will, the effectiveness. How well are they generating expected goals, or their lines generating expected goals while they're on the ice relative to their offensive zone time, basically.
So I understood that. I've sat here for a little while previously, kind of just rereading the note you had sent me to make sure like I was actually grasping it. Before we kind of try and reword or explain that a little more, you kind of talked about the offensive impact or the best offense there. I think it would be worth also trying to say that same thing just for the defensive side, even though it's very similar.
So it's almost the exact same,
Right.
using expected goals against. So basically looking at time in the defensive zone versus not in the defensive zone, the deploy, like the shifts that they start there, the shifts they don't start there. And it is math wise set up a way so the ones with the highest number are the ones who you would think are the best defensive forwards. And I know that that's sometimes a struggle to measure defense. I'm not saying that this is a perfect way to measure defense, but when we were kind of eyeball testing some of the names at the top of the list, it made sense who was up there. So again, it's using expected goals against, and then looking at basically their zone starts and taking the time in the defensive zone relative to their own teams. So a team like, say, Anaheim, Buffalo, Chicago, San Jose, who are going to get hemmed in a lot into their own zone, those players would get credit if they spend less time relative to their teammates in their own zone.
Okay, so to me, just a couple key points, and if I don't quite word this right, feel free to correct me. We pretty much have two impact category stats that are part of this max stat, offensive and defensive. And it's pretty much for offense looking at the expected goals for while in the offensive zone in comparison to others on their team.
Yes.
Defensively, just kind of flip that expected goals against time spent in the defensive zone in comparison to the other players on their team.
Yeah, and one thing that I had kind of tried to incorporate, encompass in this is a shift, just basically taking just between the blue lines, trying to give credit for not just being in between the blue lines,
Right.
trying to be on the correct end of the ice.
So pretty much being able to limit, well, just a general situation, being able to limit the other team gaining into your own end, but also not being able to then flip play down to the other end where you're kind of just flipping the puck back and forth. That's not really impacting, essentially.
So ultimately, the formula for both, and I'm okay giving the formulas here because you're good luck getting to how I got the adjusted times on ice here. So the offensive component takes expected goals and divides by, in the denominator, the sum of the adjusted defensive zone time and the adjusted neutral zone time. And then the defensive impact is taking in the numerator, the sum of the adjusted offensive zone and neutral zone time divided by the expected goals against while they're on the ice. And there you have it. Again, good luck trying to replicate without actually looking at my formulas how I did this adjusted time on ice. So
Right.
I'm not giving any trade secrets here away. Maybe a little bit, but not a ton. This is encompassing. I'm using edge stats and just kind of natural stat trick, advanced metrics, if you will.
Right. Continuing with the example of Mikko Rantanen, offensive impact scored a 1.21, which is in the 90th percentile, kind of right where you would expect.
Yep.
Especially previously looking at the sniping and passing numbers, that all kind of lines up, makes sense. Defensively, Mikko Rantanen's not usually thought of as someone who could get into the Selke conversation. He's not usually like a bad defensive player.
No.
He's just kind of middle of the road. This kind of lines up. So his defensive impact ended up at a 0.01, which is the 54th percentile. So he's pretty much average defensively. And yes, I guess a slight tick above average, but
yeah,
which is kind of what you would expect for Mikko Rantanen. Those were probably the two toughest ones to really explain and get through. If you have any questions, go ahead, ask us on whichever social media you're on. I was going to say we'll try and answer. Kyle will do his best to answer your question. I mean, I might answer if it's... easy. But Kyle's the mind behind putting this stat together.
For good or bad.
Right.
And do keep in mind, like, I'm trying to be transparent, but at the same point, like, I do want this to be ours.
Right.
So, like, I don't want to give everything away.
Exactly.
Although I've given most of, I think, the components away for calculating, but yeah.
Right, but we'll also kind
There's
of
my
know
secret.
if
There's my
someone
secret sauce.
pops up doing
Yeah.
the same exact stuff all of a sudden. 2 more to kind of go through here. Should be a little quicker. So I'll now jump to puck management.
Okay, this one I won't hold back at all. It's takeaways divided by giveaways. So players who are taking the puck away more are going to have a metric above 1. Players who are giving the puck away more are going to have a metric below 1. Or not necessarily. So that, and then that's scaled to the average for that position, which is what you're seeing as the output, to be clear. But
right. So output for Rantanen 0.56.
So he's a little bit better than the average forward.
Yep. 79th percentile.
Yep.
So pretty good.
Yep.
And that leaves something that was kind of added in. Well, not added in. It was already there. We talked a little bit. There was another thing kind of added to it to get the final kind of what it is. But what we're ultimately, at least for now, calling like the shutdown ability.
Okay, this consists of zone denials and shot blocking, basically weighed equal. Each of those components are weighed equally to get shut down, what we're terming shutdown. All names subject to change as well. This is also why it's beta.
It's kind of so. This is an interesting one. I was trying to wrap my head around exactly what to call it. It's essentially kind of like killing the play. But that's not quite exactly what's happening. I mean, a zone denial is kind of killing the play. A shot block isn't necessarily doing that. But you're defensively, your ability to limit the offense, essentially. Kind of.
Yeah. So zone denials are basically what you would expect. Again, using not using Corey's manually tracked data, but I did benchmark again to it. Came out my kind of estimate of zone denials correlates fairly well to, I don't have the exact R value right now. That it's basically looking at actions around the blue line, you're defending blue line to prevent the puck from getting into your zone. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But that's kind of the idea, is it's looking right around the blue line, which is the definition of zone denial, and it's looking at ways for players to not allow the puck in their own zone. Again, using play-by-play data, mostly play-by-play data for this. And then the other component of that is shot blocking, which is shots blocked relative to that adjusted like defensive zone time that I've come up with. So going back to kind of that defensive impact, offensive impact, I'm using ideas from there and applying them again towards shot blocking to basically give credit for players, I guess, blocking shots. And this is also very much this might get flipped again. I think I flipped it like 3 times and updated the data like 3 times with this one.
Yep.
That's what happens when you ask me to churn it out in like an hour to 2 hours, because it seems like a good idea. So that's a little less flushed out. Again, this is why we're calling it beta, but I think there's a decent premise there. And it did, I mean, again, I don't know exactly what we're trying to accomplish, but one of the things that it did do is it did improve the R value on a year-to-year correlation of the aggregate kind of metric. Again, what does that mean right now? I think that's good. It's basically saying that abilities stay more stable year to year. And I think that's kind of the end goal, not to be a full-on predictive, but at least to get a sense of where a player we can expect a player year over year.
Generally, strength versus weakness is the idea to hopefully get towards that. Rantanen not the greatest at that, so output was minus 0.61. That's 40th percentile. Again, not necessarily the area we would expect Rantanen to be strong in.
No.
Okay, so I guess to reiterate what you just said, beta, max stat beta, what you see right now is, or what you would see when we post these graphics, it's stats from the 24-25 season, the current season. I don't know exactly when we'll update them periodically.
Yeah, it might even be due. I'm thinking kind of maybe at the start of each month we'll re-download the data and refresh it and re-upload it. So maybe at the beginning of each month we'll kind of do a quick refresh. That shouldn't be that hard. But outside of just the players playing more games, nothing else will probably change until the off season.
Right, which I guess to hit on that really quickly, with this being a stat that could change or the makeup of it could change as we go year to year, you might see sniping for Rantanen at 91% or in the 91st percentile. And as we change things, it could increase a little, it could drop a little. We'll try to be clear about maybe not, again, necessarily giving away exactly 100% what everything consists of, but we'll try and make it clear if there is a change to how the max stat is calculated, that is known.
Yeah, any significant adjustment, like
Right.
small tweaks along the way, might just happen. I'd also say I feel pretty good about the 5-on-5 component, which is what we've put out there. I wouldn't have put it out there if I didn't feel pretty good about it. Like,
Yeah.
I felt good about most of this, the components and the aggregate for multiple months now, but it was still like, is this encompassing everything we want it to encompass? How's the best way to display it? And ultimately we said, let's just float it out there and see where it goes. I think the most important thing, and we probably should have emphasized this earlier, this is not necessarily playing into our projection for a player, our value projection for a player.
Correct.
It's trying to capture the player's ability, provide more information, more context, a different way to look at things. So Rantanen, like, he does fairly well in the max stat, but he's not at the very top. Meanwhile, he's at the top of the contract projection sheet.
He's very close to the top.
I mean, yeah.
So, I mean, for all forwards throughout the league, he's 96th percentile. It's not, but yes, you can't just say, okay, 96th percentile, let's go to the contracts, who's above him. There isn't. It's a much smaller sample of players in the contract, so it's not necessarily going to line up max stat to where someone would be in a contract projection.
Correct.
This is also abilities, and as you said, this is not being used to really get to our contract projection. There's a lot of other stats used for that. And what we may find in a player's abilities might not necessarily result in certain production numbers that could impact a contract projection.
I will say I kind of eye tested some of the players towards the top against some other like websites, Evolving Hockey's. There are RAPM charts in particular. That was one that I was kind of just looking at, and I would say generally players that grade out well in theirs grade out fairly well in mine. Like Mikko Rantanen, his offense is great, his defense is not great. And that's exactly how
Like,
he's reflected in what we're putting out there. So even some of the names, and we'll figure out the best way how we're going to try and give more access. Right now, the only access the public has to anyone's is basically through the contract projection graphic,
which isn't even really public
which is
access. It's
yeah.
you'd have to request to see it.
So right now you could request players who are in need of a new contract to see their max stat. So we're working on some other things, but kind of getting the projections out first, followed by the max stat, and then figuring out how we want to present, how we want to allow you to consume that. We don't have a good answer to, and that was also part of the reason it took until now to even put something out, because just like allowing people to consume it was, still don't have a good answer, but we at least have a tool to kind of integrate it in, so we decided to take that opportunity.
You've got a glimpse into it for right now. And yeah, well, now that these contracts, this round is out there, that was kind of the main priority. So focus will shift a little bit towards max stat and,
Well, probably taxes.
well, for AFP Analytics towards max stat. But yes, I will definitely say you can for sure bet that there won't be max stat changes for another
Got like 2 or 3 more weeks
4 months probably.
I have 2 or 3 more weeks where there can be maybe some level of analysis work here, and then after that, once we start hitting mid-February, yeah, it's not changing.
Yep.
If you see graphic changes, James is working on the graphics and putting it out there, but the actual numbers,
And again,
I mean, not that you can't do the numbers either, but
we'll update the numbers
yes.
month to month, but changes in how it is calculated,
Yeah.
Very unlikely to happen until after the free agency frenzy.
There's a chance in
it.
the next couple weeks I
Maybe.
get ambitious and do a little bit more, but yes, more than likely it's probably after our off-season contract projections is when I probably dive back into it.
I think that kind of, at least for now, wraps the max stat. Let us know if you have questions. Again, we'll try and answer them pretty much anywhere, social media, X, Blue Sky, Threads. And yeah, just stay tuned because it is an exciting thing, mainly because there is confidence behind it, I think, in how it's performing so far.
Yeah.
So definitely keep an eye out on anything AFP Analytics and max stat.
Correct.
We started with contracts. We're taking everyone on a pretty long episode here. I don't want to completely end it without any contracts. So we'll see how far this goes. Just a general overview of free agency, not even necessarily specific players. Something we've noticed for a while now, and I guess that means probably back to last offseason.
I've been banging this drum for a while.
Yeah. If you are, or I shouldn't say you, if your team needs a defenseman.
I mean, if any GMs are listening to us,
that's true. So I guess if you are looking for a defenseman, pretty much good luck. UFA class for defensemen.
Chychrun, Pionk, Ekblad.
Which I can tell you one of those players probably doesn't hit free agency. Good chance he doesn't, I should say.
Very good chance Ekblad doesn't.
Yep. And just to kind of continue after that, Provorov, Pedersen, Gavrikov, Brent Burns, Orlov, Lindgren, Fabro. So it kind of drops off a little bit. There's not a lot of solid names. There's some, but it's January. It wouldn't shock me. I assume general managers are also pretty aware of what the free agent class is going to look like. Washington will probably try to re-sign Chikrin before free agency.
Yeah.
Now, whether they're successful or not, we'll see because he's the top name. And if Ekblad resigns before free agency, that's good for Chikrin if he wants to test the market. But in general, yeah, not the greatest if you are in need of like a top four and certainly a top pair defenseman. There's a lot of bottom pair guys out there. So it shouldn't have much trouble if you just need someone to play uh, 15 minutes a night or something. But yeah, it's in comparison to the previous class, we like the previous class a lot more. Weren't even really high end names. Montour and Shea were, I think, our highest projected players.
Yeah.
But as we were to work down the list below them, there was more depth to that top four range.
Yeah, Matt Roy and
Right.
Dylan DeMello in particular are just they're standing
Um,
on my.
Brett Pesci was
Brett Pesci was
there.
there. Um,
So, and again, there's some names here this year. It's just at this point in the year, some of those names appear to be out there. They will probably disappear from the projection sheet as they sign an extension. Well, disappear off the off-season projection sheet.
Zadorov as well in the
Zadorov
offseason.
was there, yeah. So it was definitely a little deeper. That's defensemen. Goalies, I would say a little bit better this year as far as starting caliber 1A types and even 1B types.
Real quick before we get
Oh
too
yeah, yeah.
far away from defense, I would say there's some interesting RFA names. I'm not necessarily. I don't like. There's some that could be prime for an offer sheet. I think Edmonton did what they did last offseason by letting players walk to prevent a Bouchard offer sheet.
Yeah.
Noah Dobson we have up there as well. I know some Islander fans were questioning how high we have him, but he's probably going to get a very substantial contract. Maybe he doesn't come in over Barzal, but like he's going to get pretty substantial. But Luke Hughes up there,
Yeah.
Bo Byram up there.
Which I will mention. How do I want to word this? Interesting situations with some of these players. Byram, like what happens there?
Another in that same line, Keandre Miller.
Yep.
So Keandre Miller, I would be an example of a player that if you're a team who's looking to make a addition, maybe you can buy a little bit low asset wise. That might be because the free you're not getting much of the same upside in the free agent class.
Right.
I know he hasn't had as good of a season. I think he's getting a little bit more flack than his numbers
Yeah.
than deserved by his numbers.
In general, that entire team
Correct.
pretty much is having some issues with the numbers. And I get eye test too, and you see some mistakes here and there, but there's more going on with the Rangers than just in one individual player. Got to try to read into that and still pick out where there is still some value.
But my kind of general point here to the unrestricted class being weak. If you're a team that maybe has the ability to make that type of a move, and I'm not saying it has to be Keandre Miller, but I think there's some RFA names. Bo Byram is another really interesting one. If you could make one of those type of trades, it might be a good idea to do so, even if it is a deadline type move, because you're not going to probably find that quality in the unrestricted free agent market. Goalies.
So last year, I don't even remember who was at the top. Probably like Brossoit.
And Stolars.
I remember recording and pretty much saying like, if you need a good backup, there's some good backups out there, but there's not really a starter. I like that Stolars is kind of getting the opportunity in Toronto. Cool. Loved him as a backup, maybe even for a team to try a 1B. So glad that's working out, but it was a very thin class last year. This year, again, as of right now, a little bit stronger at the top with some, I would call them 1As. I don't know if there's goalies capable of, I think, being a clear starter, but most of them have shared time or just due to some injuries maybe have not played a whole lot as a full-time starter. Logan Thompson, Charlie Lindgren, both with the Capitals. I would assume one of them gets locked up before free agency. Maybe not, but I think it'll be tough to keep both. So one of those names, my guess would be a free agent. Aiden Hill for Vegas is a free agent. Karel Vejmelka is having a phenomenal season for Utah. Is one of the big reasons Utah is still kind of hanging around there. They're not out of it fully yet. That's one he's trending up, and if he continues that play, is going to really trend up. That to me kind of ends the first tier, maybe, in my opinion, at least play wise. We start to go down to the Kevin Lankin and Jake Allen. And then from there, in my opinion, it drops slightly. You're going to start getting into players that have some issues connected to them. Gorgiev, Freddie Anderson is good when healthy. Keyword when healthy.
And he's also now will be 35 years old too.
Right. Ilya Samsonov is having a fairly decent year as the general backup to Aiden Hill, but again, he's in a backup role right now. It's not what he once was considered to be. And you start going into the Alex Lyon, Dan Vladar, if Quick decides he wants to go somewhere else. So you start to get into the clear backup names. So a little bit heavier at the top than last season, but still kind of the 1A. We'll see this next half of the season pretty much. I would keep an eye on those top four names if any of them kind of take on even more of a role than they have recently. That might be your top goalie. Logan Thompson currently is the top projection. Do we touch on the forward group?
Forwards quickly, and then we'll wrap. I think that if some of the top names hit the market, it could be real spicy. Rottinen, Marner, Besser, Tavares even. Tavares is having a really nice year. Marchand and Nick Ehlers.
Yeah.
I think we could sit here and talk ourselves into none of those names hitting the market or a lot of those names hitting the market. I mean, or it could be in between, of course. But there's a chance that the forward group makes it really spicy. I think if the cap ends up rising up to that 97 million, could make it even more interesting. But generally what happens is one or two of these top guys end up re-signing. I still have a hard time envisioning Rottinen hitting the market. I know that what's out there, but I still think that there's a lot of posturing going on there.
Yeah.
I just have a very hard time that not getting done. Marner, I don't know about. He's 50-50 to me.
So the Marner one's interesting to me. We don't have to go too far down this rabbit hole. There's arguments to try and keep him. There's very valid ones not to as well, just from a asset management standpoint. But both of those will be interesting. The center market could get interesting. Tavares, Brock Nelson, Matt Duchene, Sam Bennett. Little better than the top of the center market last year. So we'll see if any of those guys re-sign prior to July 1st. I would say none of those players I just mentioned are completely spotless as far as not having issues. There's something with each of those guys, but in general, stronger top of the center market if they all hit free agency. There's a chance wingers are actually not a good market. If Ronson and Marner and Besser, which I'm thinking one of them hits the market.
Yeah.
And I guess Ehlers. So if we lump Ehlers into that group, I'll say two. I wonder if two hit the market. We'll see. But after that, you've got Jonathan Drouin, who's good. Kyle Palmieri, good. Jamie Benn, my guess is he re-ups in Dallas. Jason Zucker could be a good option. But then you start to get into the Andrei Kuzmenko, Taylor Hall, Riley Smith. It starts to get a little thin, and then you start to work down towards some more third and fourth line guys. So if any of those even middle ground guys I just mentioned start to sign extensions, wingers could be somewhat thin, kind of similarly to the defenseman.
Yeah, once you get past really the Palmieri, Ben, Mangiapane,
Which he's not
which
having a good year this year.
and Zucker,
Yeah.
you're though I know Mangiapane's year has not been
Right.
good. But once you get past them, you're really into clear bottom six guys, in my opinion. Maybe one or two like that you could take like Tower Hall, maybe
Could be up, but
you're starting to roll the dice on
yes.
on potential very quickly.
Absolutely.
And even some of the names that I just listed are borderline roll the dice on playing top six roles as well.
Really quick, I do want to mention just the center list continuing. Yanni Gord, Trent Frederick, Gia Suter, Kerfoot, Jake Evans, Nick Bugstad. So if you need like a third line center, could be some decent options out there. So I actually like the center market as long as most of these guys actually make it to July 1st. All right, I'm good. I'm good on contracts for right now.
I think we'll call the contract episode there. Next episode we have planned is kind of a discussion around the collective bargaining agreement. Going to talk a little bit about where we would like to see it kind of go, some ideas that we would have, some things that are out there, our thoughts on it. It's kind of it's going to be a relevant topic soon, so we're going to kind of get out ahead of it. So with that, we appreciate you listening. Max Term Podcast, available on pretty much every single major podcast platform. Our content, including the contract projections, and Max, if you want to tune in to see more on Max Stat, follow us on X, Blue Sky, Threads. Again, trying to cross post on all of them, but we're probably still most accessible on X. So appreciate you listening, appreciate you engaging, tuning into our content, and we'll talk to you next time.